Hi everyone. The UI you tend to use today, especially the UI you like to use, is no longer very static. They tend to be very lively and very fluid. Take for example your favorite websites, your favorite applications, or the interface on your favorite devices like your iPhone or your iPad. You'll notice that as you're playing with them, things don't just jump from point A to point B suddenly. They're animated. They feel alive. And one of the things that makes all this possible is a technique known as transitions. And in this video, we're going to take a look at how to make your own transitions in HTML and CSS very easily. So let's get started. So before we start looking into the technical details of how to create CSS transitions, let's just take a look at a handful of websites that I think do a really nice job highlighting what I mean by when I say that the good UI nowadays is very lively. So take for example USA Today. It's a newspaper and it has some content currently displayed in the text section that I'm currently on. And as I'm hovering over some of these sections, notice that the opacity of the image changes and some text appears. Pretty cool. But what's really interesting is that, let's say I want to navigate from the text section to the travel section. So I click on travel and notice that as the page is loading, you have a loading indicator, and the page didn't just load by just taking you from one page to another, it actually slid you in. There was a very nice way of making me feel like this page is really coming alive, to use an example that I talked about before. And not all transitions, not all examples of making your UI come alive need to be quite as elaborate and quite as noticeable as what the USA Today site has. So for example, Google Music does a really nice job of very subtly providing me with an information of all the albums I have, and when I hover over it, you get some UI that appears or animates into view that I can then click on, and as I'm clicking on it, you can see some animation that plays to indicate the progress of the song being loaded and then actually playing. And there are many examples of UI where things animate and things do more interesting things when interacting with them than what I've shown you, but this should give you a basic taste of what it means when I talk about transitions. So let's get back to our slides. If I had to generalize on one of the things that makes good UI, it is that good UI tastefully animates you between states. And you saw some examples of that in the USA Today and the Google Music example. Now, the way we're going to bring some of this tasteful animation to life is by something known as a transition. And what a transition is pretty simple. It's a visualization of change over a period of time. And you might know it as another name, which is animation. There are subtle details between transitions and animations, but I won't get into those right now. At a high level, animations and transitions can be generalized as follows. You have a start state, you have an end state, and you have a duration, the time it takes for something to go from the start to the end. So in this example, I have a circle whose size is basically changing over a period of time, and the various states in the middle are the interpolated states, the parts that you see that end up making the animation or transition that define what's going on here. And you can generalize almost all animations and transitions that you've seen using this basic model, the model being the start, duration, and end. Take, for example, the USA Today website. The start is the page I was on, the end is the new page that I'm navigating to, and the duration is how long it takes for the page to slide from one location to another. Now, let's go into a little bit more technical detail. So I mentioned that you're sliding the page from one location to another. What exactly is changing in this case is some value. Let's say the position value, the horizontal position value to be more specific, of the page itself. It is at one position at the start of my navigation, and it's another position at the end state of my navigation, and everything in between are the intermediate states, the intermediate values of the position as it is sliding from one location to another. And those three things feed really well into what you need when you're working with transitions in CSS. So in CSS, a transition needs three things. It needs the CSS property to apply the transition to. It could be the position, it could be the color, it could be the opacity, it could be a whole host of things that CSS properties can define. A CSS transition needs to know how long it will go, what is the duration, how long will it last. And the last thing, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail, is the timing function, the easing function to use to basically take you from point A to point B. Will it be a slow and linear progression from one location to another? Or will it be an acceleration? It starts off slow, then suddenly speeds up. Or will it be a deceleration? It starts really fast, but then slows down as it reaches towards the end. And these little details end up defining some really noticeable aspects of what makes your transition or animation really, really nice. So before we look at writing some CSS and creating an example that uses transitions, there's one more thing I want to talk to you about, and that is a transition property. In CSS, you have a property called transition, how convenient, and it takes 3 arguments. The first argument is the property you want to listen for changes on. The second argument is the property that defines the duration. How long will it take for your transition to go from point A to point B? In this case, it's half a second. And a third argument is the property that defines what kind of easing function or timing function to use. We'll get to that one in much more detail shortly. So just for now, know that it exists, and the value we'll be using is something called ease in, and we will cover some other variations of it in a little bit, and also learn more about what exactly it does. So, all right, let's get started with writing some code. So here I have a very simple example, and basically there's nothing really going on here. So what I'm going to do is just write some simple examples of markup to sort of highlight how transitions can be used in a very simple way. So right now I have a page currently displayed. It's empty, they have a title and nothing really interesting going on. So what I'm going to do is just add a div. I'm going to keep this example very, very simple. And what I'm going to do next is add my style tag. And in my style tag, I'm just going to make a few small style rules. Add my body style rule, and let's make it margin and padding to be both 0. Nothing fancy going on here. Margin 0, padding 0. And for the 2 div elements that we have, let's go ahead and define. Let's give it a background color. And let's give it a background color of, let's make it yellow. And let me pick the yellow color. And let's give it a height of 100%, width of 100%, and a position of absolute so that it actually works. I mean, this is an example. I don't suggest you do this exact same thing on your own. Okay, let's go and preview the page as is and see what's going on. So as expected, when I preview this page, I see a bright yellow background, which completely syncs up with what you see right here. Great, no surprises there. So now let's go ahead and make something that creates a change in this value, some interaction that will cause this value to change. And the easiest way to do that in CSS, especially as you are learning how to use transitions, is use the hover pseudo selector. Basically, what I'm saying right now is when I'm hovering over this div, anything that is mentioned in style rule will become active. And what I want to do is change the background color. Let's make it into let's make it a gray. Let's make it into a gray color. So let me go back to my browser and just reload what's going on. And at this state, now you see a yellow background. Notice my mouse cursor is on the browser Chrome. As I hover over the page itself, the color changes to a gray color. Basically, the background color property goes from yellow to gray when I hover over it. Now, what we're going to do is add a transition to animate the transition of the background color from one value to another. And the way we're going to do that is very simple. We're going to do that by adding the transition property. So I'm going to add the transition property, and I'm going to find the CSS property that defines the background color. So I'm going to type in background color, which is the name of the property, and let's go ahead and make the duration of it just 0.3 seconds, something pretty short, and the easing function will be ease in. Great. So now let me refresh the page. So by default, the background is still yellow. When I hover over it, notice what happens. The gray sort of fades in. It just kind of gradually becomes apparent that the color is changing. It's not a sudden jump like you saw before. And that is a very simple example of what a transition does. Okay, so now that you've seen a transition in action, I can give you a much better explanation of what exactly it does. See, a transition is pretty sneaky. The moment you declare a transition and your application is running, your transition is running immediately. It is listening for changes on the properties that you told it to listen for. In our case, it is background color. So when I hover over the background color on my div element, before I get to see the result of the background color property in the hover style rule, before it kicks in, your transition interjects and it animates the change of your background color from its initial yellow value to its final gray value over a period of, in this case, 0.3 seconds with an easing function of ease in. See, pretty sneaky, right? Okay, so this example is pretty simple. Let's look at one more example, and this one will be a little bit more involved and hopefully more representative of how you might use transitions in real life. So let me go, I'm going to paste this example in. I don't think you want to see me write a whole lot of code on this one. And what this example is a very classic image slider. I have an image. Let me just show you what the image looks like. And this image is made up of two halves. It's one image, but it has two different visual regions. One is a black and white version of the HTML5 logo, and the other is a yellow and orange colorful version of the HTML5 logo. And what I am doing is when this page is shown initially, I'm clipping the entire image to only show one portion of it. And when I hover over the image, I am essentially translating it to slide the second half of the image into view. And of course, this is done without a transition, so the effect looks something like this. Here's the image, here's what I see, and when I hover over the image, you see a sudden change from the yellow part of the image to the black and white version. It's very sudden, very, very, very blunt in how it's getting there. Let's fix that. Let's go ahead and, in this case, add a transition. The way you add a transition is no different than what you saw before. I'm just going to define add a transition property, and in this case, the property I care about is the translate 3D function, but I'm going to do something very different. I'm going to type in transition, and instead of defining the CSS property that I care about, I'm just going to type in the word all. What this tells me is that any property that is changing in this style rule or any style rules that rely on it, this transition will listen for changes on it and it will animate those changes. So this transition is all, it'll take 0.5 seconds, and the easing function again is going to be ease in. That's it. So now let me go back to this page, let me reload. And now that I've done this, when I hover over the image, notice what happens. Instead of the image jumping from the colored region to a black and white region, making it look like a background color change less than as opposed to the actual image sliding from one location to another, the transition makes it very obvious. I start off with the yellow version of it and I hover up, and then the transition moves up again. Pretty sweet. So now, before we wrap things up for now, let's look at the next part of what it is. So we talked about easing functions. I mentioned it. I talked about how important it is. Now let's actually talk about what they are. So the easing functions are probably the most important things you'll specify as part of creating the transitions that you use. So what they really define is the nature of how the property values that you are animating, how they change. So you have various values here. You have ease, linear, ease in, ease out. The names of it aren't particularly important. Let's first look at what kinds of, what the easing functions basically do. They alter the rate at which your values change as they go from, the starting point to the ending point. The most basic case is a linear change, where at each given point in time, there's a constant rate at which a property that you're listening for is actually changing. This is very robotic, very mechanical, and often something that you don't really associate with realistic animations. The other kind, which I have a simple example of here, is a deceleration. You start off really fast, and the property value starts slowing down its rate as it is reaching its destination. And these are all defined by your ease property, the value of ease, linear, ease in, out, and the step functions and all of that. So depending on what you end up using, your animation will be very, very different. So just to show you how mechanical linear looks like, let me change the easing function on this particular transition to linear, and let's look at this example again. Notice that it's very subtle, but you can sort of see that there's no change in how the image slides. It starts and ends at a very constant rate. So all this is pretty neat. But what's really cool though, and what I really want to focus on, is this value right here, the cubic Bezier function. See, the built-in easing functions are okay, but for the most part though, they're okay and boring. Now, what makes it really interesting is if you define your own custom easing function. And the way I do that is by going to a website called cubicbezier.com. And what this website does is it gives you the formula for very common eases, but I'm going to go and just create something completely random. So in fact, let's actually make this go a little bit up like this and then bounce. And I'm going to preview it to see what it looks like. So that's kind of cool. And I'm going to copy and paste this into where my where the easing function has currently been defined. So I'm going to type in, just paste this value in. Because remember, the cubic Bezier function takes 4 numbers as its argument. And let me just make the formatting of it a little easier so you can see it. And these numbers make no sense unless you are really in a math wizard. So using a site like this is very helpful in helping you define what you want to do and how your browser understands what you want to do in all these weird numbers. Okay, so now I've added it in. Let me save this document and let's preview this example one more time. So in this case, now that if I hover over it with the new easing function, notice what happens. It is not just a simple slide or an acceleration, it's a very noticeable bounce. It is pretty neat, and I think this is a whole lot cooler than what I saw before. And you can play with the easing functions in various ways to get you examples that are as crazy as this, or something that is probably more tasteful and more in line with whatever it is that you are designing. The last thing to do before we call it quits is that the transition property I've shown you was very neat, was just in one line. And what I showed you is basically the transition shorthand property. What you actually have is a longhand version of it where you can define your individual values as their longer property definitions itself. So for example, what I had before as transition all 0.5 seconds ease in is basically something that looks more like this. You have a property called transition property, you have one called transition duration, the easing function is specified by the transition timing function property, and you also have a property called transition delay, which allows you to specify how long you want to wait before your transition actually kicks in. I didn't talk about that property in much detail now, but you can read about it or just find it online if you ever run into it. But in general though, unless you really have a need to have the longhand property defined, I'll just stick with the shorthand versions. Save yourself the keystrokes, save the very limited bandwidth that it will take to download all these extra characters. So the final thing before we wrap things up is to talk about probably the most frustrating parts about working on cutting edge features like animations today, and that is vendor prefixing. So in modern browsers today, you can just type in transition all 0.5 seconds ease in and everything works fine. On slightly older browsers, you need to prefix this property with the appropriate extension, appropriate vendor prefix. And the common ones are Moz for Mozilla, MS for Internet Explorer, O for Opera, and WebKit for Chrome, Safari, and other browsers based on WebKit. And here's what it actually looks like. So you could spend time and duplicate all this markup, the number of times for the browsers you care about, but instead you add the JavaScript library, it runs through your page, and when your browser is about to display everything, it makes sure the right vendor specific version is displayed. So you don't have to worry about it, the browser takes care of it, and it's a win-win situation. I actually recorded a video all about vendor prefixes as well, so you can take a look at that to get a much better overview of how prefix free works and all that. In fact, in the example that I showed you right now, I actually have a reference to prefix free, which avoids me having to type in -moz -transition and do all the the kind of the yucky browser prefixing work that I never really like to do. All right, so with that, I really don't have too much more to add beyond what you've already seen. Basically, CSS transitions are awesome. If you ever have CSS properties that are changing as a result of some user action, do consider adding a transition to make that, make the change of the property value something more lively than just a sudden change from one value to another. If you are going to be using CSS transitions, one of the most important things you can do is ensure you're using the correct easing function. You can use any of the built-in easing functions, or if they don't really suit what you're trying to do, create your own custom one. Use the cubic Bezier function to specify your own values that make your easing function do some pretty neat things. And obviously, not all of us are good at coming up with those numbers that map to what we really want to do. So I use the cubicbezier.com website to help me with that. There are a host of tools and websites out there that you can use as well that give you the same exact result, which is the values to plug into the cubic Bezier function. So to learn more about transitions, go to kuba.com and just search for it. I've written a collection of videos and articles that touch upon various angles of how to better use transitions in your HTML documents. If you need any help, you can post in the forums. You can find me on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube. Just put a comment here. I am all over the place, so figure out a way to find me and I will try to get back to you very quickly. And last, if you found this video pretty useful, you'll probably like my book, Animation in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, a whole lot. It basically is hundreds and hundreds of pages of all sorts of fun things that are animation and transition related. So definitely check it out. You can find it in paperback and Kindle editions on Amazon.com. And with that, I will see you guys later as part of another video.